Hans Niemann playing the Italian opening with 3 bishop c4 as white against Magnus Carlsen and some of the other strongest grandmasters in the world. Are you kidding me? That's right, folks. Today, Hans Niemann is giving all of us a masterclass in the Italian opening as white. And of course, we are kicking things off with Hans Niemann's epic grudge match against Magnus Carlsen, the man who accused him of cheating in 2022. Now, in the game, of course, Hans Niemann, he's our hero for this video. He's playing as white. He opens 1e4. Magnus responds e5, his solid move. And here, Hans Niemann, he goes straight for the Italian game with knight f3, knight c6, then bishop c4. And Hans Niemann, he absolutely loves the Italian opening. He plays this more than the Ruy Lopez with bishop b5. He just loves his Italian game. Of course, the idea is you get the bishop out to the c4 square, pressures f7, and finally, he prepares short castling on the king side. Now here, black has a variety of options, and in this game, Magnus Carlsen starts knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4. Hans Niemann defends with d3, the best move, and here Magnus goes for an interesting setup with h6 and d6. So he starts h6. The idea behind this move, of course, is you are gaining control of the g5 square. There will be no knight g5 or bishop g5 in this game. However, Carlsen also has the option of going g5 himself in some situations, depending on what he wants to do. Now, from here, Hans Niemann, he plays c3, the standard Italian move, preparing the idea of d4, breaking in the center. And now Magnus Carlsen shows his true intentions. He goes for a more passive setup with the move d6, and then after a4 for Hans Niemann, he goes bishop to e7. Now, this is a very solid setup from black, but it is a little bit more passive. Now, typically in the Italian game, black is going to want to have that bishop out on the more active c5 square where it controls this long diagonal here. However, there is one drawback of having the bishop on c5. On c5, it is vulnerable to d4 breaks from white, gaining a tempo on the bishop. So with the bishop on e7, it is a little bit more secure. It's never going to be hit by a d4 break, but it's also a little bit more passive. So interesting choice overall by Magnus. Now, Hans Niemann, in the Italian game, Hans absolutely loves this idea of pushing a4 and then a5 and even a6 in some situations. This is just a Hans Niemann special, and today that is exactly what he goes for. He starts a5, gaining more space on the queen side, and now Magnus Carlsen has a big choice. Do you want to stop that pawn with move a6, blocking it forever, or do you allow Hans Niemann to try to break on the queen side with the move a6 himself? Well, in the game, he chooses the latter option. Here, Magnus castles, and Hans Niemann goes for the insane idea of simply a6, gaining even more space on the queen side. Now, this move a6 is very interesting. It technically wasn't required. White could have simply gone knight b to d2, short castles, h3, any other number of moves here. So with that in mind, why did Hans Niemann go a6 in this position? Well, it is a very novel idea. I'm sure Magnus Carlsen hadn't really seen this idea before in this position. So Hans Niemann is trying to throw Magnus a curveball, give him an idea he hasn't seen before, and there is obviously the threat of simply a takes b7, trying to open up the a file, damage black's pawn structure. Now here for black, the best idea is going to be simply d5 either immediately or after taking the pawn on a6 first. As the old saying goes, a flank attack is best met with an attack in the center. So for example, either d5 immediately or b takes a6, then white plays any number of moves, let's say castles only, then going d5. So a pretty standard Italian game idea from black that would have been the best. Instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen goes for the move b6. Now this is a very double-edged move. On one hand, it does weaken the light squares around the queen side. So for example, all of these squares here are much weaker for black. However, the one benefit of this is this pawn on the a6 square is going to be vulnerable for the rest of the game. So if white is not careful, that pawn could be lost in the future. Now from here, both sides play very logical Italian game moves. Here, Hans Niemann, he castles, and Magnus Carlsen challenges the bishop on the c4 square with the bishop on e6, bishop e6, and here Hans has a few different choices. Popular options are taking on e6, or in general in these structures, knight d2 is also okay, defending the bishop on c4. Now from here, Hans Niemann, he takes on e6, the best move. Black takes back with the f-pawn, and here Hans Niemann just continues normal development. Knight b to d2, then rook e1. Of course, both these moves further support the e4 pawn, which allows Hans Niemann to break in the center shortly here with the move d4. And of course, beyond that, this knight may want to go to the g3 square via f1 and then g3 in the future. Now from here, Magnus, he just continues centralizing. Rook a to d8, very good move, perhaps preparing the move d5 in the future. And this is where Hans Niemann really has to start making some critical decisions in this game. So far in the Italian, Hans Niemann with a standard development, rook to e1, knight to d2, pushing the a-pawn down the board. But now he has to decide which part of the board does he want to play on. There are options for expanding on the queen side with ideas like b4 and queen a4. There's also the central expansion with d4. And finally, there are even ideas of playing on the king side, knight f1 to g3, perhaps preparing some sort of f4 idea. Now from here, the best move for Hans Niemann is actually going to be b4. And we're going to see throughout the game, this idea of expanding on the queen side is consistently the top choice of the computer in this line. Now, the idea behind this is you don't have to break in the center with d4 right away. Instead, you can slow play it and just gain more and more space on the queen side, slowly improving your position and asking black, what are you going to do, as black has a very difficult time slowly improving his position in this kind of game. So, for example, here the main line, after b4, perhaps black wants double rooks on the f-file. So rook f7, but then b5 from Hans Niemann would be the best idea, gaining even more space. And then simply rook b1, defending b5. Perhaps you want to go c4 or d4 next. So that would have been the strongest idea. Instead of that, Hans Niemann goes for more of a central and kingside style of play, starting with knight to f1. Of course, this is the standard Ruy Lopez and Italian game maneuver, knight f1, perhaps knight g3 coming next. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen, he turns up the heat. He tries double rooks on the f-file with rook f7, followed by rook d to f8. Now, once again, b4 from Hans Niemann would be the right idea, trying to gain space on the queen side. Instead, h3 on the board, then Magnus rook d to f8, and finally Hans knight to g3. Now, real fast, first of all, b4 was, again, very playable here. However, the best move in this position is actually knight 1 to h2 instead of to g3. Now, here's the idea behind this move. Black obviously has a ton of pressure on this f-file. Magnus may even be looking to sacrifice a rook at some point in the game on the f3 square. However, when you have that knight on h2 defending the knight on f3, that rook sacrifice idea is never going to be an option. However, instead, Hans Niemann goes knight to g3 in the game. Of course, the knight does support e4 here, which makes d4 breaks that much easier. But now, white is vulnerable to various rook takes f3 ideas. So let's say Magnus Carlsen really wanted to sacrifice a rook on f3. How would he do it? Well, here, the best move is going to be knight to h7, simply prepping rook takes f3. And it turns out almost no matter what Hans Niemann does in this position, that idea of the rook sacrifice is going to be fair game. Here, rook takes f3 is actually the best move. The idea is after g takes f3, black's going to go knight to g5. The best white can do is take the knight, and suddenly black has a complete lockdown on the king side. I mean, just look at his control of the dark squares here. f4 lockdown, h4 as well. That pawn on f3 is going to fall sooner or later, and there's not a whole lot white can do about it. So overall, knight to h7 in this position would have been very strong. Instead of that, Magnus Carlsen goes for a different idea, and that is queen to c8. Now, this move looks a little bit strange. The idea is he wants to put pressure on that pawn on the a6 square, so obviously the rook can't move away from the a-file. However, beyond that, there may be options of trying to win that pawn in the future, perhaps knight to b8 targeting a6, maybe knight d7 to c5 targeting a6. So Magnus kind of playing with fire. Of course, the drawback with this move is the queen is now further away from the king side and the center, and that could be a problem later in the game. Hit, wake, wake. All right, now Hans Niemann, bishop b3, continuing development, perhaps preparing d4 next. And here, Magnus Carlsen has a tough decision. It turns out there isn't really an easy way for him to improve his position, and he may need to just kind of sit and wait. So a couple of ideas would be queen d7, just bringing the queen back to the center, or maybe knight h7, preparing ideas based on rook takes f3. However, instead of those, knight to d7 e7 played in the game. Now, this move looks logical. Just like knight a7, you are clearing the f-file for a potential rook sacrifice, and even if the rook isn't sacrificed, those rooks have tremendous pressure on the open f-file. However, the problem with this move is the knight starts to move away from the king side, and that's kind of where the knight needs to be. So now, Hans Niemann, he simply breaks in the middle of the board with move d4, and real fast, once again, I just have to point this out, there are other ideas that Hans Niemann could have pursued. Of course, there is the idea of playing on the queen side, and you can do that with b4, or even the stronger idea of queen to a4 immediately, trying to put pressure on that knight on the c6 square. But instead of that, d4 played in the game. Very solid idea for Hans Niemann. He's definitely still in control in this game so far. Now here, Magnus Carlsen plays a series of very questionable moves. I'm not really sure what the idea was. He starts by taking on the d4 square. E takes d4, and Hans Niemann takes back. C takes d4. Now, so far, releasing the tension like that in the middle, giving Hans Niemann that beautiful pawn center wasn't really the right idea. And here, Magnus just goes off the deep end with the move knight d to b8. Of course, the idea is he wants to pressure that pawn on the a6 square. However, Magnus Carlsen, his knights and his queen are basically abandoning the fight for the center. And here, if Hans Niemann was sagacious enough, he may have found the critical idea, and that is the move d5, simply breaking in the center. Now, the main line from here, black would take, white takes back, and now we have this knight jump. The knight jumps into e5, and white's knight jumps into d4. And this is the position you're aiming for when you play the move d5, breaking in the center. Here, after knight to d4, white's knights are just dominating the board, and black's light squares everywhere are just so weak. I mean, you could just see this knight on d4 jumping into the e6 square at some point, and this knight on g3 may even go to e4 or f5 at some point. So this would have been absolutely crushing for white. But instead of that, Hans Niemann starting to choke a little bit, and he plays a slow, passive move, queen to e2. So up until this point, Hans Niemann playing simply fantastic chess, but this move does not speak for itself, and in fact, it gives Magnus Carlsen the opportunity he needs to just fight back on the queen side and the center. So he starts his plan with the move knight to b4. Oh my goodness, all these pieces ganging up on the pawn on a6. However, there is another idea. Here, black wants to counterattack on the queen side with the move c5, and that is exactly what happens here. Here, Hans Niemann goes rook e to c1, trying to keep both of his rooks active on the queen side, but Magnus does not care about the potential x-ray attack on the queen. He correctly decides you can simply break immediately with the move c5. And here, Magnus Carlsen, despite having a kind of a worse opening throughout this entire game, he's starting to seize control of the game. Now from here, Hans Niemann tries to gain more space in the center with e5, but Magnus just locks down the center d5. And again, another weird looking move from Hans Niemann. He takes the pawn on c5, black takes back, and this pawn structure for Magnus Carlsen is actually quite good. I mean, typically in this kind of pawn structure, white is going to want to attack on the king side and black on the queen side. However, here black has the f-file and the king side on lockdown, and that means he kind of has a free hand to take over the queen side, and still that pawn on the a6 square remains incredibly vulnerable. Now here, things are already somewhat critical for Hans Niemann. This is a blitz game. However, he had to find the best idea, and the best move here, it turns out, is actually rook to a4. Now, the idea behind this move is if black does nothing, white's going to go rook to a1 next, and suddenly that pawn on the a6 square is adequately defended. So with that in mind, black is going to want to take the pawn immediately. Knight 8 takes a6. But then, all the same, white can simply double up rooks on the a-file, pressuring the knights and the pawn on a7. And here, Hans Niemann would sort of have sufficient counterplay for now. He's still a little bit worse, but he would still be very much fighting in the game. However, instead of that, he plays a very cute idea, knight to d4. Of course, that knight on the d4 square cannot be taken, because then the attack is opened up from the rook on the queen on c8. That would be a colossal blunder. Of course, Magnus Carlsen does not do that, especially not against Hans Niemann. And instead, he simply gets this queen off the c-file, transfers it to d7, and this is the best square because you're off the c-file, but you're also still defending that pawn on e6. Now here, Hans Niemann, he plays another critical mistake. he jumps back with the knight to the c2 square. In fact, there were other better moves, perhaps simply knight to f3, admitting that your idea of knight d4 wasn't very good. That probably would have been the better choice, but instead, knight to c2 on the board. And the problem with this move is black. He can either go d4 right away, as Magnus did in the game, or he can simply trade on c2, then rook takes c2, and finally d4. So in the game, d4 played, gaining more space in the center and blocking off this bishop. Now Hans Niemann, another cute move, rook d1, once again trying to pin the queen. Magnus Carlsen not amused, knight d5, breaking the pin, and now bishop d2. And just look at Magnus Carlsen taking over in this game. He has the pawns in the center, dominating. The rooks are on the open f-file. His knight on d5, very strong. And his knight on b8 is about to jump into the c6 square. And from there, it's going to pressure e5. Oh boy, Hans Niemann, he is in trouble. And of course, it is currently black to move, and that means things go from bad to worse for Hans as Magnus simply takes on f2, capturing a pawn and threatening the queen. Now Hans, queen g4, good idea. There is a hidden threat here, of course, that being the idea of bishop takes h6, and the pawn would be pinned to the king. So Magnus, king h8 defending, and now Hans Niemann again trying to increase the pressure, knight h5, and funnily enough, Hans Niemann is threatening checkmate in one move on the g7 square. So again, Magnus, no dummy, he's going to defend, bishop d8, indirectly defending the pawn on g7 with the queen that now has access to it. And now here, Hans Niemann, he has 30 seconds left on the clock, Magnus Carlsen has 17 seconds, and Hans Niemann decides it is in his best interest to simply put Magnus under as much pressure as humanly possible, even if these moves aren't necessarily the best, and he lashes out on the queen side with the move b4, kind of a weird looking move, but let's see what happens. Here Magnus, instead of taking on b4, he simply brings his knight back into the game, knight c6, and the knight attacks b4 and the pawn on the e5 square. Hans Niemann is in trouble, and here Hans takes on c5, Magnus takes on e5, hitting the queen. Oh no, this is just getting so bad for Hans. And I'm a big Hans Niemann fan, by the way. There's a reason I'm doing 5 of his games in the Italian game, but I had to start with this rematch versus Magnus Carlsen. All right, now Hans Niemann, what is he supposed to do? Obviously, the threat against the queen means the queen has to move, and there is simply no good option. Technically here, the computer likes the idea of queen takes g7 best. The idea is you want to trade into an endgame. However, here in this endgame, Magnus Carlsen is going to win this pretty much every single time. He is the endgame GOAT for a reason. So with that in mind, trading into a worse endgame with queens off the board, not a good idea. Instead, maybe the best move was queen to g3, keeping pressure on the knight on e5, and the queens do stay on the board for at least a little bit longer. But instead of that, Hans Niemann here, he goes for the move queen takes d4. Of course, he is winning a pawn and pressuring the rook and the knight, so how can this move be bad? Well, it turns out Magnus has an unbelievable rook sacrifice here. The idea is rook takes g2, and after the king takes back, king takes g2, then the crushing move is simply queen to c6, and you're setting up that x-ray attack on the king. The knight's going to move somewhere, perhaps double check here, perhaps double check here, and white's king is not going to be long for this world. But instead of that, Magnus Carlsen, he's in time pressure. He has 13 seconds on the clock. He goes bishop c7, simply defending the knight and also getting the bishop onto a much better diagonal here. And now Hans Niemann, queen e4, not the best idea. And here Magnus Carlsen triples up the major pieces on the f-file. This is known as the Alexander Alekhine battery with the rook, the queen, and the rook lined up like this. Oh boy, Hans Niemann, my man, what's he gonna do? In the game, knight g3, getting the knight away from the attack of the queen. But Magnus Carlsen does not let up. Here he goes for a ridiculous-looking knight sacrifice. Knight to f3 check. What the heck am I looking at? The knight is hanging, the rook is hanging, as now the queen is not defending the rook. I mean, this just looks completely insane. Now, first of all, king takes f2 does not work at all. The winning move here is simply knight takes d2. You have the check on the king has to move, and in the meantime, you simply pick up the queen. That is not good. So instead of that, g takes f3, played by Hans Niemann. He's doing his best to defend, but then Magnus simply rook takes f3, and getting rid of that knight was a small price to pay for blowing open white's king side, and now, of course, the knight on g3 is being attacked, and after the knight moves, queen h5, attacking h3, Oh, this is just devastating. Now, Hans, he keeps defending. You got to give credit to this guy. He continues fighting until the end. His fighting spirit speaks for itself. Here he defends queen g4, offering a queen trade. Obviously, Magnus declines. He goes queen to e5. The queen now on this terrific diagonal, threatening queen to h2. That would be checkmate. Now, here the best defensive resource for Hans is queen to g2, defending the h2 square. But even that would lose very, very quickly. Instead, knight to f4 on the board. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he just cleans the F up. He starts by taking the knight on the f4 square. And of course, this does temporarily hang the rook on f3, and Hans Niemann takes it. But it does not matter. Knight e2 check next, hitting the king, hitting the queen. Oh my goodness. Now, king g2, queen h2 check, king f1, rook takes f3, winning the queen. The king has one square, e1, and finally in this position, Magnus delivers the finishing blow, queen to f2 checkmate. Wow, what a game. And if you thought that game was exciting, wait until you see the next one where Hans Niemann goes up against his other arch nemesis, Hikaru Nakamura. You do not want to miss this one. Now in game number 2, Hans Niemann is playing against none other than Hikaru Nakamura, and once again, Hans Niemann goes for the Italian opening with the move 3, bishop c4. Now from here, Hikaru goes for the main line with knight f6, d3, and then finally bishop c5, getting the bishop out to the main diagonal here. It is very, very active and pressuring f2. Now both sides follow the main line, white castles, d6, c3, prepping the idea of d4 next. Now here Hikaru has a big decision to make. There are 2 main lines in the Italian for black with the bishop out on the c5 square. There are the lines starting with a5 and the lines starting with a6. Now these two moves may look similar, but they lead to wildly different positions. Now Hikaru is a big specialist in the line starting with the move a6. The idea of this move is you are giving the bishop a retreat square on a7 where it's going to go to at some point, and from there black's going to continue very solidly with the moves like castles, perhaps rook e8, and then bishop e6, bringing the bishop out to challenge white's bishop on the c4 square. So overall, these lines with the move a6 are very, very solid for black. Let's see how it plays out in the game. Now in the past, of course, from here, white would typically go for moves like bishop b3, knight bd2, bishop c2. However, in recent years, this idea of a4 and perhaps even b4 later, getting space on the queen side, they have taken over as the main response to black's a7 to a6 plan, and that is what Hans goes for in the game, a4 on the board. Now Hikaru, bishop a7, very standard stuff, getting out of the way of b4 and d4 ideas from white, and now both sides continue developing, going down the main line. Hans, rook e1, h6, controlling the g5 square. There will be no knight g5, bishop g5 ideas now. And Hans, knight b to d2, Hikaru castles. Hans Niemann, h3, stopping knight to g4 ideas that, of course, would be pressuring the pawn on the f2 square. So very, very important to play h3 here. And Hikaru starts the plan of bishop e6. He goes rook to e8 first. He wants to go bishop e6 next. That way he can recapture on the e6 square with the rook instead of the f-pawn. Now Hans, b4, gaining space on the queen side, and Hikaru goes for the standard plan, bishop b6, bishop takes, rook takes. Now this right here is one of the primary positions of this entire line with a6 in the Italian game from black. So far, Hikaru playing ultra solid. He has literally 0 weaknesses. He may want to go queen d7 and then rook a to e8 next, and finally breaking in the center with the move d5. So that is Hikaru's basic plan here. White, on the other hand, Hans Niemann has a wide variety of plans. He can either play on the queen side, going for ideas like b5, in the center going for d4, or even on the king side, going knight f1 to g3, and then perhaps with ideas like knight h4 to f5, queen to f3, and so on. So Hans Niemann here literally can play on any part of the board that he wants to. Now here on move 13, Hans Niemann goes for the most popular move, queen to c2. This move has emerged as perhaps the most flexible option white has. Of course, there are plenty of other ideas. Bishop b2 is quite popular, knight f1 is good, and even some rook moves like rook b1 are playable. But of course, queen c2 on the board for Hans Niemann, very solid. Hikaru goes queen d7, of course preparing the idea of rook a to e8. This is black's standard idea in the a6 Italian. He wants to break d5 and just clamp down on the center. Now here, Hans Niemann, he plays perhaps the first really interesting move of the game from white's side. He goes rook to b1. Now with this move, Hans Niemann is declaring his intention to play on the queen side instead of the center or the king side. And now, of course, the immediate threat is simply b5 from white. So for example, If Hikaru were to continue the plan with rook a to e8, then the move b5 would be the move for Hans. Now from here, the knight, of course, is being attacked. It has to go somewhere. Let's say knight to e7. Hikaru will go knight to g6 next, getting the knights on the wonderful f6 and g6 squares. But here Hans could do the same with knight f1, or he could immediately break in the center with move d4, and all of these pawns are sufficiently defended. And of course, Hans Niemann would have a significant space advantage on the queen side and in the center with the pawns on d4 and e4. So instead of allowing all of this here in this position, instead of playing rook a to e8, Hikaru Nakamura immediately clamps down on the queen side with the strongest move, and that is b5. So, of course, the obvious idea is you're playing b5, simply clamping down on the queen side, stopping b5 from white. But beyond that, you're also trying to make that rook on the b1 square look a little bit silly. I mean, now that b5 is not an option for white, what the heck is the rook doing on b1? It'd be much better placed on the a1 square, as the a file may be opening up shortly here. Now, of course, Hans Niemann, he's no dummy. He immediately recognizes all of this. He retreats with the rook back to the a1 square. The rook is no longer needed on b1, so of course, a very good move. Now here, I'm not the biggest Italian game expert from the black side. However, I still think continuing with the idea of centralizing the rooks, perhaps rook to e8 or even rook to d8 would have been in order, and maybe black could follow up with the move d5 in short order. However, instead of that here, Hikaru plays a relatively passive move against Hans Niemann. He goes rook to b8. Now this idea obviously defends the b5 pawn, and it gets the rook off the perhaps vulnerable a file. I mean, if Hans Niemann were to take on b5 at some point in the future, then the a file would be opening up, so maybe the rook's better placed here, but overall this does look a little bit passive to me. Now here, Hans Niemann, once again, he has a choice, and I think the best move for Hans here is going to be the move knight to b3. Now, of course, the idea is the knight is very well placed on the queen side here. It has access to the d4 and the a5 squares, and let's compare this move to the move Hans Niemann actually played in the game. In the game, he starts by taking on b5 first, a takes b5, a takes b5, and only then goes knight to b3. Now, to me, this does not look quite as accurate. Instead, if we go back to this position here, we see the pawns on the a4 and a6 squares are still there, and this does give Hans Niemann some additional possibilities, specifically the idea of going a5 at some point in the future, trying to clamp down on the queen side and get even more space. So while this move a5 may not be the best idea immediately, the fact that Hans Niemann can retain that idea in the future and for black to take on a4 at some point would be a big strategic mistake. But I think overall this would have been a better version of what Hans Niemann did in the game, in case you're curious. But here Hans Niemann taking on b5, then knight b3, not a bad idea by any means. Now Hikaru, bishop b6, prophylaxis. Yes, the knight on c6 was temporarily defending the bishop on a7, but good idea to get the bishop off the open a file. And now Hans, bishop e3. The idea is that bishop just wasted a tempo going to b6, so now is a perfect time to threaten exchange of bishops. That way black, if he takes, which he did in the game, he's technically sort of losing a tempo going bishop b6, then bishop takes e3. Now here, after this bishop trade, we have a really tense middle game position between Hans Niemann and Hikaru Nakamura. Now the big feature of this position, of course, is the pawn structure on the queen side and the center. Now it may look relatively symmetrical. However, Hans Niemann does have the advantage that he can play for the breaks c4 and d4 at some point. Meanwhile, it's much more difficult for Hikaru Nakamura to achieve the same effect. I mean, that knight on the c6 square, ideally, black would have a pawn on c6. That way, he could break at some point with either c5 or d5. However, as it stands, having the knight on c6 means he's going to have a little bit more of an awkward time. And of course, we also have to consider white's powerful rook on the open a file, another little advantage for Hans Niemann in this game. Now here, Hikaru, rook e8, retreating the rook. Of course, e6 was not the best square for the rook, so a very good retreat. And now Hans Niemann, rook to e1, doing the same thing. Both sides sort of mimic each other here in this position. Now Hikaru, queen c8, and a kind of a weird move from Hans, king h2, perhaps setting up f4 ideas or over defending the h3 square. And now both sides start to shuffle their knights. Knight to d7, knight a5 from Hans. We trade knights on the a5 square. Now Hans has a little bit of pressure on that b5 pawn, so Hans Niemann slowly increasing the pressure in this game. Now Hikaru, c6, that move we talked about earlier. Great square for the pawn. Now Hikaru's pawns are all perfectly defended here. Now Now, Hans, queen a2. Of course, the big feature of this position is going to be the open a-file, so Hans Niemann doing everything he can to double up on the a-file, perhaps even tripling up in the future and thinking about an invasion on the a7 square potentially. Now, Hikaru, knight to f8. The idea is the knight is better placed on either e6 or g6. Solid idea. And finally, Hans Niemann manages to break on the queen side with the move c4. So Hans saying now that the knight is on the f8 square, this is the perfect time to strike on the queen side right before Hikaru can fully consolidate. Now, of course, there is a drawback to this move c4 here, and that is the fact that Hans Niemann has lost a lot of his flexibility with his pawn structure. Specifically before, in this position, Hans Niemann is never at risk of overextending, whereas here, after c4, Hans really has to think about the defense of, for example, the b4 pawn if black were to take here, and then suddenly the rook has pressure on b4. And real fast, I do want to point out, instead of the move c4, here the computer loves the idea of simply knight to h4, eyeing that f5 square. And really the only way to stop knight f5 is to go g6, but that would simply create more weaknesses on the king side. I mean, Hans could think about ideas like queen d2, pressuring h6, and so on. So overall, knight h4 may have been a more flexible idea where you don't have to commit the pawn structure on the queen side right away. But instead, c4 played in the game, not bad at all. Here Hikaru takes, and of course Hans Niemann takes back with the queen. If he took back with the d-pawn here, then b4 would simply fall, and Hikaru would have a huge advantage here. But instead, queen takes c4 on the board, good stuff. And Hikaru, queen b7, trying to increase pressure on that weak pawn. So again, this being the big drawback of that early c4 break, now Hans Niemann has to really think about the defense of b4. And instead of defending, here Hans Niemann decides it is best to simply counterattack against the weak pawn on c6. Now we could have this potential trade where black takes on b4, white takes on c6. So let's see what happens. Rook e to c8, Hikaru defending. But again, Hans Niemann, rook a6, just increasing the pressure. And now after knight e6 from Hikaru, we finally have these trades. Rook takes c6, rook takes, queen takes, and of course Hikaru takes back the pawn on the b4 square. So now finally we have this relatively equal looking position. Almost everything is the same except for the placement of these pieces. I mean, literally an identical pawn structure in the center and on the king side. Now here, the rest of this game isn't really too exciting. I'm going to breeze through it. It's really not relevant for our Italian game discussion, but still, wonderful game by Hans Niemann. Even way back in 2022, pressing Hikaru Nakamura in a rapid format and really applying the pressure throughout the entire game. Really well done. But before you go, this next game is going to blow your mind. This game just happened between Hans Niemann and Wesley So at the Chess.com Speed Chess Championships. Of course, it was the round of 8 match, and as usual, Hans Niemann going for the Italian opening with bishop to c4. And just as fast as I could change my t-shirt, here Wesley So goes for the absolute main line as black with bishop c5, d6, and then finally the move a5. Now, this is the absolute main line of the Italian game these days from black's perspective. This move a5 clamps down on the queen side, gains space, and prevents white from going b2 to b4, and that means this bishop on c5 is going to be relatively stable for a little while. Now, of course, there are some drawbacks to this move a5 from black. It does weaken the b5 square, and that may play a critical role later in this game. Now, from here, h3 from Hans Niemann, trying to clamp down on that g4 square, making d4 better idea in the future, and black does the same thing, h6 clamping down on bishop g5 and knight g5 ideas. Now from here, the main line typically continues knight b to d2, black's going to go bishop e6, white goes bishop b5, and here black has a whole wide range of options. Queen b8 is a Ding Liren favorite. Wesley So typically plays bishop a7, but even other ideas like knight to d7 are also possible. However, instead of all this, here on move 9, Hans Niemann throws a big curveball for Wesley So, and he goes for the move bishop to b3. Now, typically, this move is played with the idea of retreating back to the c2 square at some point with the bishop. It is a little bit slow, but let's see what Hans Niemann has in mind. Here, Wesley So, bishop e6, simply challenging the bishop. And here is the big surprise from Hans Niemann. Here he goes, bishop to a4. What the heck? I mean, this move definitely makes a weird impression. In the main line, the bishop's going to be on b5, and the knight goes to d2 right away. And it's not really clear what white gains by going bishop to a4 instead of knight b to d2 here. here? Well, let's see. Here, Wesley So, bishop a7. Very good move. Retreating the bishop to the safe a7 square and getting out of the way of the future d4 advance. Now, Hans Niemann, knight b d2. And here, Wesley So, rook to b8. The idea is you're threatening b5, hitting the bishop and gaining even more space on the queen side. So what does Hans Niemann do? He goes bishop to b5. Okay, this move is just incredibly strange. What the heck? I mean, here black basically gets the free moves bishop to a7 and rook to b8 compared to the main line that we saw over here in this position right here. So now going back to the current position, how does this change the game? Well, bishop a7 is a very useful move black always wants to have, while on the other hand, rook to b8 is kind of a weird move. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when the bishop's already on the b5 square and b5 is not possible. So overall, I think Hans Niemann just trying to throw Wesley So off guard as was a blitz game, so he's just trying to get into his head a little bit and give him something he hasn't seen before. Of course, instead of bishop b5, the main moves here would have been knight to f1, intending knight g3, or even bishop takes c6, intending a very fast d4 now that the c6 knight is no longer there and is no longer defending the d4 square. So overall, bishop b5 on the board, and now Wesley So, knight to e7. The idea is you want to go knight to g6, perhaps c6 and d5 at some point. Again, very, very standard stuff from black's perspective in the Italian. Now Hans Niemann, d4, controlling the center. And knight to g6, the standard rerouting of the knight for black. Now Hans Niemann, knight to f1. And here we finally reach the end of the opening phase of the game. Wesley So takes on d4. Hans Niemann takes back. Then we have d5, e5, and knight to e4. So this really is the real starting point of this game. Everything up until this point was basically theory, but now both sides are starting to sort of think for themselves and find their plans. Now from here, the big feature of this position, of course, is going to be the pawn structure. White has the king side pawn majority of 4 versus 3 on the king side. Meanwhile, black has the advantage on the queen side, the 4 versus 3 on the queen side. And that basically means white is going to be attacking on the king side, black on the other side of the board. And of course, the other big feature of the position is going to be the knight on the e4 square. That knight is incredibly powerful, and Hans Niemann needs to find a way to challenge the knight immediately. Now, the two most obvious moves, at first glance at least, are going to be bishop to d3 and knight 1 to d2. However, it turns out both of those moves have their own issues, and here Hans Niemann finds the best move. It is a little bit surprising. He goes for it with the idea of knight to g3. Okay, this move looks insane. I mean, obviously, black has the option of simply taking on g3 and doubling white's pawns on the g file. I mean, that is not something you typically want to have as white. However, that turns out to be a mistake, so this turns out to be a very, very good move from Hans Niemann, simply challenging the knight on e4 right away. Now, from black's perspective, taking on g3 is not going to be a good idea. Instead, the best ideas are going to be either f6 or f5, trying to open the f-file and challenging white's position, or even the daring advance knight to h4 with the idea of white takes recapture with the queen on the h4 square. And if white doesn't recapture, you can always take the knight on f3, removing one of white's attacking pieces. However, none of that happened in the game. Here, Wesley So immediately took the knight on g3, misevaluating the resulting position. I mean, here Hans Niemann takes back, and let's slow down and talk strategy here. Yes, white does have these double pawns. However, white's king is going to be incredibly safe on the h2 square, and meanwhile, white has the open f-file to use to attack, and this g-pawn on g3 may even be a battering ram later in the game. So overall, while these pawns may be a weakness in the endgame for right now, they're actually quite helpful for Hans Niemann. Now, Wesley So, f6, good idea, trying to counterattack with that pawn on the e5 square, sort of French defense style counterattack. Now Hans, king h2, excellent move, getting the king to safety and defending the g3 pawn. Now Wesley, bishop f5, bishop d3 from Hans, and we have some more trades in the center, f takes and d takes. Now the pawn structure here is even more imbalanced than it was before. White obviously has that pass pawn on the e5 square. Meanwhile, Wesley So has the 4 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side. We're basically looking at an all-out attack on opposite wings here. Now, Wesley, the best idea here is going to be getting those pawns moving right away. The obvious move is c5. Instead of that, he plays a little bit more passively, more solidly with the move c6, but this turns out to be a big mistake. And here Hans Niemann just goes ahead and punishes it immediately, takes on f5, queen d3, the queen's coming into the game, and the rook's quite vulnerable on the f5 square. Now Wesley defends, knight e7, simply supporting the rook on the f5 square, but Hans Niemann continues to increase the pressure at bishop f4. And here the threat is simply e6 with the x-ray attack on the rook. Okay, Wesley, he continues to defend, and here, Very interesting idea from Wesley. Queen to f8. And as you can see, the queen and the rook are both lining up against that bishop on the f4 square. Perhaps there's going to be an exchange sacrifice. And Hans Niemann forces Wesley's hand. He goes e6 with the discovered attack on the rook. And here Wesley decides it is time to chop that bishop off. And this is the best move. Rook takes, e takes, queen takes. Wesley so giving up the rook in exchange for a bishop and a pawn. And more importantly, he also has quite good activity with his pieces now. So from here, Hans Niemann, g3, trying to get rid of that active queen. And here, Wesley So makes maybe the biggest mistake of the game so far. He retreats his queen to the d6 square. And this looks very obvious. Looks like a very good, natural move. What could be more natural than getting the queen to a centralized square like d6? However, the problem is that queen is now cut off from the defense of the king side thanks to this annoying pawn on the e6 square. So instead of that, queen to f5 or perhaps queen to f6 would have been a better idea. But queen d6 on the board, and here Hans Niemann, he just increases the pressure. Knight e5. The idea is you want to jump into the f7 square or maybe g6 with the knight, and of course that pawn on e6 cannot be taken because then knight takes c6 with the discovered attack on the queen and the attack on the rook on the b8 square. So, of course, Wesley So demonstrating his sagacity. He does not take the pawn on e6. Instead, rook to f8, activating the rook. Not a bad idea, but Hans Niemann here jumps in with that knight to the f7 square. That knight is a monster. It is like my Colombian ex-girlfriend. You do not want to mess around with that knight right now. Or my Colombian ex-girlfriend. Oh my goodness. Okay, here, Wesley So, queen to b4. The idea is counterattacking on that pawn on b2. Of course, Hans Niemann has to defend rook e2 with the defense of b2. And now Wesley, he commits another grave mistake. It is the right idea, but the wrong time for this move. He goes for the counterattack on the queen side with c5. Of course, the basic idea is you want to get those queenside and center pawns moving down the board, threatening to promote. However, it turns out it is just too slow in this position. Instead, perhaps queen to d4 would have been a better idea. You're offering the queen trade. That would have gotten some of the pressure off, and that queenside pawn majority in the endgame could be a very valuable asset, and white's attack is kind of disappearing. But instead of that, c5 on the board. Now Hans Niemann, rook to f1, getting the rook active on that f-file. Very good stuff. And here Wesley So, he keeps trying to increase the pressure. c4, what else are you going to do? But now queen f3. Just look at all of these pieces lining up on the king side. Most of black's pieces are still way over here on the queen side away from the defense. And that is going to spell disaster for Wesley So in this game. Now Wesley, rook c8, once again, continuing with the wrong idea, piling up too many pieces on the queen side. Yes, this was a blitz game. It's hard to be too hard on these guys. So Wesley trying to fight for the initiative, but he misses the next move from Hans Niemann, and that is knight takes h6. Oh my goodness, this is devastating. After g takes, you jump in with the queen to the f7 square, forcing king h8 from black. And here Hans Niemann has a wide variety of winning ideas. Perhaps the best move is queen to h5. The idea is you're threatening the pawn on h6. If black defends, then you have ideas like rook f7. So that would be an absolute disaster for black. Instead, he makes a little bit of a mistake here. Rook to f6. Now this move looks logical. Of course, you are threatening that pawn on the h6 square. However, there's one problem with this move. And you know what? Let's make this a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now. Try and find the key defensive resource for black to stay in the game. I typically don't do defensive resources like this, but this one's a good one, so go ahead and try and solve it. All right, did you find it? The key move here for Wesley, shockingly, is bishop to e3. Now, the bishop is, of course, defending h6, and you might be wondering, what if white just takes the bishop? Then you have queen to d2, you win the rook. And then after the rook falls, d6, of course, covered by the queen. Oh my goodness. And somehow, someway, Wesley stays in the game. So, of course, in this position, Hans Niemann does not take that bishop. Instead, h4 on the board. The idea is he wants to control that g5 square and also giving a little bit more loft for the king in case he needs it. So, definitely the best idea. Wesley So counterattacks in the center, d4. Give him a few more moves. That pawn's going to be a queen. This is very dangerous. And here, once again, Hans Niemann, he has to find the right idea. That's going to be queen to h5, but he doesn't find it. Instead, Hans Niemann, rook to f3, a major mistake. And here, Wesley So is actually not only back in the game, he has the advantage. Hans Niemann in one move blew his entire advantage in this game. Oh my goodness. Here, the best idea from Wesley is going to be rook to g8, offering more defense on the king side. He misses it. He goes knight to g8. I guess the idea was over defending that h6 square. However, here, queen to g6. The threat is rook f7 and then rook to h7 or queen h7 checkmate. And in this position, Wesley So, he runs out of time in this blitz game. Yes, Hans Niemann is winning. So even if he didn't lose on time, Hans Niemann would have secured the victory. Wow, what an incredible game by Hans Niemann. All right, this game was played in 2022 between Hans Niemann and Fabiano Caruana. It was a doozy. If you like attacking chess, you got to watch this. So in the game, Fabiano Caruana goes to the main line with knight f6, then bishop c5. So far, very standard stuff. Hans Niemann c3 and a5 on the board. This move is very popular at the highest level, and this game is completely different from the last one, and you'll see why in a hot second here. So Hans Niemann castles, d6, standard stuff, rook e1. And here the first big deviation from the last game, bishop a7 on the board immediately. Now typically black does castle before that, but bishop a7 right away, also perfectly playable. Now Hans, knight d2, castles, h3. And here Fabiano Caruana goes for the old line with bishop e6 before playing h6, perfectly playable. Wesley So also plays this quite a bit as black. And overall, this might be the safest way to play the Italian game as black. a5, bishop a7, bishop b6 with no h6 on the board. Now from here, Hans Niemann, bishop b5, capitalizing on that weak b5 square, very common theme in these a5 lines. And now Fabiano plays the main idea, that is knight to e7. You want to go knight to g6, perhaps c6 at some point, and everything is just ultra solid for black so far. Now here Hans Niemann, d4, taking control of the center. That is quite a big achievement. Knight g6 from Fabiano. Of course, the alternative there was simply to move c6 right away. c6 is often a part of black's game plan, but instead knight g6 on the board. And now here Hans Niemann has a big choice. Typically black is going to follow up with the move c6, so it's a good idea to get that bishop off the b5 square right away. And there are quite a few different options for Hans Niemann. Bishop a4 is playable, bishop d3 is good supporting e4, and even bishop f1 is actually pretty playable. It's a little bit unusual to have that bishop on the f1 square. Typically the knight is going to go there, but here it works out quite well. Now in the game, bishop a4 played. The idea is you want to reroute that bishop to the c2 square at some point. And here Fabiano shows his big idea. He starts kingside play with the move knight to h5. Now this is very, very strong in this whole line with a5, bishop a7, then knight e7 to g6. This really is the key idea from black. Of course, you're targeting that f4 square right there. And this is kind of a big problem for white. You typically do not want to go g3 here, as that stops your idea of knight f1 to g3. But if you don't play g3, that knight, of course, has easy access to the f4 square being supported by the other knight. So already a very double-edged position. Now, knight f1, knight f4, and knight to g3. Both sides finished rerouting their knights. This is very, very tense. And here Fabiano has a wide range of options he could play. The most standard move here is going to be c6 and eventually f6 supporting the center. So, for example, c6 here, one of the main lines is simply bishop c2, queen d7, knight f5, and then f6. And yes, this is the Ben Feingold counterattack. As I like to say it, Ben Feingold, not a fan of the f6. However, here it does become quite playable. And real fast, one other crazy line I want to show you. Another good option for black, shockingly, is the move queen to c8. And yes, the idea behind this move is the sacrifice on h3. So, for example, here, one idea white has is knight to e2, the strongest idea, trying to challenge that knight on the f4 square. And here, black can actually sacrifice the knight on g2, just a clean knight sacrifice, but you do win that pawn on h3 as well, and black seems to get an ongoing kingside attack for the piece. So as you can see, all of these Italian lines are just ripe to blow open. But instead of that, here Fabiano Caruana goes for the simplest and probably the most solid weakness-free option, and that is simply taking on d4. White takes back with the knight, black takes back again twice, and then d5, breaking in the center. Now, this move is so good for black because it turns out the move e5 here is actually not particularly good for white. And of course, that is a problem. That is typically white's main idea here in this position. So instead of e5, white's best idea is going to be maintaining the tension with something like bishop c2, queen f3, something like that. But instead, Hans Niemann does go for the move e5 here. Now, at first glance, this is the most logical idea. However, However, it is one big problem, and that is the fact that black can start very active play on the king side with the move queen to h4. Now, the problem here is black just has so many pieces on the king side. f6 breaks are coming, and white's going to have a very difficult time defending. Of course, there are all sorts of sacrifices on h3, on g2 that white has to worry about. But instead of that, here, Fabiano Caruana misses the queen h4 idea. That was a big error on his part. Instead, he goes for the move f6. Now, perfectly reasonable move, kind of a French defense style move, chopping away at that pawn wedge on e5. However, this does give white the time he needs to get rid of some of these minor pieces on the king side. He starts by chopping away that knight on the f4 square, and then he jumps into h5 with his other knight, and suddenly the knights come off the board, and here Hans Niemann just has a solid edge. Black really doesn't have any attacking chances anymore. Now, from here, Fabiano's best idea is going to be chopping away at e5 right away. The computer gives f takes e5, then rook takes, and bishop to f7, hitting the queen. And here, black is essentially perfectly fine. He has a weakness-free position. Of course, white has 3 pawn islands compared to black's 2. And that means black is going to have an advantage in the endgame if white doesn't get an attack going. But instead of all that, here in this position, instead of f takes e5, Fabiano Caruana goes for the much more double-edged idea, and that is f5. Oh my goodness, the cojones Fabiano Caruana must have had in 2022 facing off against Hans Niemann, the man whose chess speaks for itself. Now, this is so double-edged because now the pawn structure in the center of the board is much more fixed, and that means the attacks are going to be happening on both sides of the board, on the king side and on the queen side. So both sides are essentially all in now. So Hans Niemann here, f4, trying to lock down the center. Good move. And now queen e7 from Fabiano Caruana. The idea is he wants to prepare the idea of c5 breaking on the queen side. So very solid move. Now Hans Niemann, a4, trying to control that b4 square. There will be no queen b4 ideas. And finally, Fabiano plays his idea, c5, breaking on the queen side. Now what happens from here? There's quite a bit of tension here. Well, rook ac1 from Hans Niemann. And now Fabiano plays the best move, but once again, very, very double-edged. That is c4. Oh my goodness, he locks the queen side. He gets the advanced pawn here. And now, as you can see, both sides are basically all in. Hans Niemann's going to go for something like g4 potentially, whereas Fabiano Caruana, he has to get that b5 break in as fast as possible, then push b4 and try and get a passed pawn on the queen side. Now here already, this is a very critical position for Hans Niemann, and he finds the best move, and it is not easy to find at all. That is the idea of queen to d1. Okay, why was this move so necessary here in this position? Well, I'll show you. Let's say instead of queen d1, white plays a decent move, but not as good. Let's say king h2, one of the computer's top lines. Here, the problem with this is Fabiano Caruana has the immediate pawn sacrifice on the queen side with the move b5. So of course b5 is the move black wants to play, so you always got to check this. Let's say white takes it, the best move. Then the key idea for black is going to be a4. You block out the bishop from being able to retreat, and this is already very, very dangerous. Yes, the queen can retreat, you are threatening a4, but then rook f to b8, hitting the bishop, and white is forced to take on a4 with the bishop. Then black rook takes b2, and suddenly black is crashing through on the queen side where he has the space advantage. So this would be colossal disaster for white if he allowed that. So Hans Niemann demonstrating his sagacity once again with the move queen to d1, immediately defending the queen side. Now here, Fabiano Caruana, not to be outdone by Hans Niemann's epic move queen d1, he goes king to h8, and this represents a complete reversal of his strategy. Now, instead of attacking on the queen side with b5 as white has that locked down, he's actually going to go g5, potentially rook g8, and try and get a king side attack going. Oh my goodness. Okay, here, Hans Niemann, bishop b5. The idea, of course, he wants to stop b5 advance from black. However, this move a little bit slow, kind of ignoring black's idea, and now g5 on the board. Here we go. Oh my goodness. Okay, Hans Niemann, once again, not responding the best way. b3. I mean, this is just not good trying to play on the queen side. Now Fabiano, g takes f4, blowing open the g file. Rook g8 is coming. Maybe queen g5 or queen h4. This is not good. Okay, Hans, b takes c4, continue his idea, and rook to g8. Both sides now attacking on opposite sides once again. Fabiano on the king side, and Hans Niemann on the queen side somehow. Okay, from here, rook to c3, or rook lift, not a bad idea, but it doesn't particularly work here. is Fabiano Caruana just takes on c4 twice. D takes, bishop takes, rook takes. And we see already that rook moving twice from c3 and then back onto c4 right away. So Fabiano taking advantage of the poor placement of the rook on c3, getting a tempo on it, and now immediately the move queen takes a3. Now Fabiano is up a clean pawn. He has 2 passed pawns on the queen side, and Hans Niemann's only saving grace here is these passed pawns in the center. Perhaps he can get them moving, trying to promote, but it's going to be a tough battle. All right, Hans Niemann, rook c2, over defending g2 and getting the rook away from the vulnerable c4 square. Not a bad idea. Of course, b5 was coming at some point, and now here Fabiano, he goes for it. F3. Of course, the pawn is pinned to the king, and the queen can't take, because after queen takes, once again, the pawn is pinned. So F3, a very punishing blow to Hans Niemann's position. Now here Hans, he tries to get the counterattack going in the center. This is the right idea. Those passed pawns must be pushed. However, Fabiano does not care. He's not slowing down. F takes G2. Excellent move. And in fact, the alternative would have been a massive mistake here real fast. If Fabiano had played rook takes g2, this move, of course, has to be considered. But here, rook takes, f takes, and then e7. And suddenly, white's passed pawns are just too far advanced. This is a disaster for Fabiano. So Fabiano, excellent move, f takes g2, keeping the active rook on the g8 square. Now here, Hans Niemann, his best chance is going to be pushing those pawns as fast as he can, as we talked about. And the best move here is simply d5. But instead of that, queen e2 on the board. But I'm not so sure that was completely necessary. Now Fabiano, queen takes h3. Another pawn falls. And he's threatening queen h1 in certain lines. This is not good. Oh boy. Okay, Hans, queen e5 check. Rook g7. Now the rook is pinned to the king. Good idea from Hans. And now rook c to c1. The rooks are connected, but queen h1 all the same. King f2, queen h4, king e2. And now a key move for Fabiano, f4. The threat in certain lines is going to be f3, followed by rook to f8. Not good. What is Hans Niemann going to do? He starts rook g1, trying to defend, but then queen g4, king d2, and f3. Oh my goodness, those pawns are basically one move away from just being an absolute disaster. Okay, Hans Niemann, king e3, covering the f2 square. The king enters the game. What am I even looking at here? Okay, king g8, getting the rook out of the pin of the king. Now the rook is in the game again, and rook c2, trying to defend f2 again. But now rook f8. Just look at all of these major pieces from Fabiano lining up. These pawns are too slow. So what does Hans do? Rook f2, trying to get a blockade. Not a bad idea. But then the h-pawn enters the game. Queen d5, rook e8, and in this position, Hans Niemann resigns to Fabiano Caruana. He's down 3 pawns. These pawns are just slashing down the board. There is nothing he can do. Hans getting blown off the board here. But still, what an incredible game. And it is the 5th and final game. Hans Niemann, of course, going for the Italian game. And today's opponent, Daniel Naroditsky, goes for the sharp idea with knight f6, d3, and then h6, potentially threatening g5, gaining space and attacking on the king side. Now, this was a blitz game played in 2024 between these two chess giants, and let's see what happens here. In the game, Hans Niemann c3, and then Daniel immediately goes for the very aggressive move g5, gaining space on the king side and threatening g4. Now, this is not a brilliant move, but I'm giving it 2 exclamation points for style points. And of course, this is not really a brilliant move, but I'm giving it 2 exclamation points for style points, because typically you don't play g5 right away. Typically what you want to do here is to go d6 first, and then after white moves, only then go g5. So what's the problem with g5 immediately, and why is this technically a little bit inaccurate? Well, here Hans Niemann has the resource d4, breaking in the center right away. Of course, the best response to a flank attack is an attack in the center. Let's see how that works out. Here, d4, and already Hans Niemann would be threatening d takes e5 or knight takes e5. Black's going to have to respond by taking on d4 or going d6. If he takes on d4, then e5 is the right response, hitting the knight already, and if black instead goes for d6, then white gets a very good endgame, just taking on d5, taking the queen. Of course, the knight has to take back here, because otherwise the f7 pawn falls to the bishop. So knight takes and then h4, blowing open the king side, and white is going to have a big advantage here. So it's a very long-winded way of saying d4 in this position would have been the key idea for Hans Niemann, but instead he goes for the plan he almost always plays in the Italian. That is the idea of a4 d4, intending perhaps a5 and even a6. I mean, I've analyzed a bunch of his games in the Italian lately, and Hans Niemann always seems to go for this. Now, technically, this move is a little bit slow, and here Daniel Naroditsky has the opportunity to punish Hans for not going d4, immediately breaking in the center. And the way to do that is with the move g4 immediately. So, for example, g4, you hit the knight has to go somewhere, and then you break in the center with d5, and this is just very good for black. He pretty much equalizes on the spot. So, for example, he takes, knight takes, and suddenly black has a big space advantage. That pawn is covered by the bishop, and he's looking good. So, instead of that, Daniel Naroditsky did not go g4. Instead, d6 on the board, transposing back to more typical-looking positions. And here, once again, Hans Niemann, a5, pressing on the queen side. And now Daniel, he decides it is time to block the pawn immediately. There will be no a6 idea like we saw Hans play against Magnus Carlsen earlier. So here, a6, blocking the pawn. And this move looks logical, but there's one big problem with it. That is the pawn on the f7 square. Instead of a6, black perhaps should have played the move bishop to g7. That way, if white ever went queen b3, trying to gang up on that f7 pawn, black could simply castle and have a great game with the pawn defended by the king and the rook. So instead, here, a5, a6 on the board, and now queen b3 is what Hans Niemann plays. This is the best move, piling up on f7, piling up pressure on b7, and what the heck is black supposed to do? Well, queen e7, that does defend, but the queen is somewhat awkwardly placed on the e7 square. It's not really an ideal move you want to play. So Hans Niemann already fighting for a relatively large advantage out of this opening. Now, both sides continue developing. Hans h3, bishop g7, knight d2, short castles, all very standard Italian game stuff. And then Hans Niemann plays a move I have never seen in the Italian game from white side before this game. That is g4, blocking the king side. My goodness, this is a really weird looking move. I mean, now white's going to have some sort of problems castling on the king side, but the queen side isn't very safe either with the pawn on a5. I mean, what a weird looking position. Now, of course, the drawback of this move g4 is it does weaken the f4 square. So you can just imagine, for example, black getting a knight there, perhaps knight d8 to e6 to f4. That would be incredibly strong. And Daniel, he spots the idea. Knight d8 immediately rerouting the knight to the e6 square, potentially to f4. Now Hans, knight f1, again doing the same thing, knight going to e3 or g3, eyeing the f5 square, the best square for the knight in this position. And here Daniel, he abandons the idea of going knight e6 to f4, instead playing in the center with the ideas c6 and d5. So here we go, c6, Hans Niemann jumping forward with the knight, and then d5, breaking in the center. Already, this is a tremendous amount of tension. So what the heck is the idea of this move? I mean, isn't Daniel simply sacrificing a pawn? And the answer is sort of. So obviously, Hans Niemann takes here. The bishop has literally nowhere else to go. E takes d5 is forced. And now, as you can see, Hans Niemann can simply win a pawn. If Daniel captures back, he can recapture with the knight or the bishop with a great game. So Daniel, instead of doing that, here is the idea. This move d5 is actually a deflection move. You deflect the e-pawn away from the e4 square, and then you crash through with the move e4. Oh boy, you can already see the queen lining up with the king. This is Daniel's idea, sacrificing a pawn for active play in the middle of the board. Now here, Hans Niemann, this is a critical position in the game, highly tactical. He has to find the right idea. And I tell you what, let's turn this into a puzzle. If you were Hans Niemann here, how would you respond to this position? It's not exactly a forced combination, but there's a very clever tactical idea. Let's see if you can find it. All right, I hope you found it. Okay, the key idea here, you take on e4, black takes back with the queen. Of course, that queen threatens the knight on f3. Then you go queen d1, simply defending. And then the best move for black is knight takes d5. Of course, you are ganging up on that knight on the e3 square. And here is the brilliant idea that Hans missed. Rook to a4 with the pressure on the queen, threatening all sorts of bishop moves with a discovered attack. And of course, the rook also defends the bishop after a move like knight takes e3, then bishop takes. So wow, what an idea. Unfortunately, our hero, Hans Niemann, he does not find it. Instead, jumps forward with the knight to the d4 square. But this is exactly what Daniel Naroditsky wanted in this position. Here, e takes d3, the e-file, getting blown the F open here. I mean, the computer still gives Hans Niemann a big advantage, but I'm starting to worry about Hans' position already. All right, now here, Hans, bishop d2, best move, preparing long castles, getting his king away from the center. Now Daniel takes on d5, white takes on d3, and then knight to c6. So a slight change of plans, and I'm no longer going to the e6 square. Instead, c6, and from the c6 square, that I puts a lot of pressure on that pawn on a5. That is going to be a big factor in this game, as we're going to see. Now Hans, this guy's a fighter, immediately castles queenside. Now this move is significant because that rook on the a1 square was defending a5. It looks like knight to c6 stops long castles, but Hans Niemann disagrees. He castles anyway, and this move is computer approved. Now from here, Daniel, what is he supposed to do? Does he take the pawn on a5 or do something else? Well, taking on a5 is what he does in the game. There were some other options. Perhaps the most attractive alternative would have been knight takes d4, c takes, and then bishop to e6. You support the pawn on d5, and you also open up that c file for either of the rooks to come crashing through. This would have been another good option. Instead, knight takes a5 played in the game. Of course, the problem with this is the knight could be misplaced on the a5 square. Now Hans Niemann, queen a4, attacking the knight. Queen c7 defending, and here Hans Niemann, again, another very critical position. There is a mind-blowing attacking idea that Hans Niemann missed here. Of course, this is a blitz game. It's very understandable why he missed it, but the key move is actually the pawn sacrifice h4. Now, this move is utterly ridiculous. I mean, first of all, you give up the pawn on g4, then the knight attacks f2, forcing both of the rooks, but you don't care. The key line here, you just take on g5, ignoring knight takes f2. Then in this position, you take on the d5 square. Of course, the knight was defending d5 earlier, but now here, d5 unprotected. And instead of taking the rook, you actually give up the bishop on the d3 square, king b1. And despite being down a piece in this position, White's attacking chances are so good that he actually has a crushing advantage. So, wow, what an idea. h4 ultimately leading to a bishop sacrifice out of nowhere. Instead, Hans does not find that understandable. Instead, knight d to f5 played in the game, that knight pressuring the bishop on g7, and f5 just being a wonderful square for the knight in general. Now Daniel, bishop to d7, excellent move, hitting the queen with tempo and freeing up the c8 square for either of those rooks. Now Hans Niemann, queen to a3, kind of a weird looking retreat for the queen. Instead of that, I think queen to c2 would have been a little more precise, but instead, queen a3 on the board. Now Daniel, rook f to e8, activating the rook. And here Hans, he finds the right idea at the wrong time. He pushes through with the move h4. We saw earlier that this move would have led to a crushing attack, but here it is just too slow. Daniel takes on f5, White takes back, and now that pawn on the g4 square is simply hanging, and White has nothing to show for it after knight takes g4. Now, fortunately, Daniel doesn't find that move. He decides bishop f8 is the way to go, keeping that bishop on g7 alive and hitting the queen on a3 with tempo. Now, of course, that bishop on d7 no longer alive, which means a4 is now a good square for the queen again. And here Daniel jumps forward with the knight. We basically have all-out attacks here against the two kings. And Hans takes on g5. And Daniel, knight to c5, hitting the queen. Now, this position is absolutely wild. The most obvious idea, of course, is going to be retreating the queen, perhaps to a2, perhaps to c2, getting it out of the line of fire. But that is simply too slow in this position. Instead, the key move for White is actually going to be bishop to f4. Instead of defending the queen, you simply counterattack. And the lines from here are just absolutely insane. This video's gone on long enough. I'll let you explore that on your own if you're really interested in it. But bishop f4 was the best move here. Instead, queen to c2 is what Hans chose in the game. And this is typically the right square for the queen in this game. However, here again, just a little bit too slow. Now Daniel jumps forward with the knight. Knight a to b3, checking the king. King goes to b1 and queen to a5. Here, Daniel is threatening checkmate in one move with the queen being supported by the knight. Of course, Hans has to do something about it. So what does he do? Well, he finds literally the only way to stay alive in this game. I mean, again, another great puzzle. If you like puzzles, this one's a good one too. Just throwing it out there. All right, in the game, Hans Niemann, knight takes h6, hitting the king with check. Of course, black has to respond. He takes the bishop, takes h6. Now here again, if you take the bishop, that is checkmate in one move. You don't want that. So instead, here, Hans Niemann, bishop h7 check, hitting the king again. It may look like desperation, just throwing out checks out of nowhere, but the king moves, and then the key idea, queen to f5. What this move does, besides further activating the queen, frees up the c2 square for the king. And that means after queen to a1 check, as Daniel Naroditsky played in the game, king c2, suddenly the queen is under attack, and Hans Niemann continues to fight. All right, queen a4 from Daniel, king b1 from Hans. This is sort of a implied draw offer. If Daniel wanted to draw by repetition, he would go queen a1, king c2, queen a4, king b1 with a draw. But instead of that, Daniel fights on. He knows he has the better position. He wants to attack. Rook a to c8. Very good move. The rook lining up with the c file. There may be some sacrifices on c3, for example. Good stuff. Now Hans, he makes the last fatal mistake of the game right here. Bishop to e3. This is just too slow, and Daniel responds knight to e4. Here, oh boy, you can just see all the pieces lining up, ready for his sacrifice. Now Hans, he takes the bishop on h6. Of course, that bishop has been hanging the last few moves. Finally takes it, and here Daniel Naroditsky, he finds the finishing blow. Knight takes c3, blowing open the queen side. That king is effed, and here in this position, Hans Niemann resigns. And real fast, this is a first checkmate in 5 moves. Here's how it works. King c2, only move. Then knight e4, and here you have to do some sacrifices just to stave off the attack. You sack the queen. Queen takes, rook takes. You sack the bishop. Bishop c5 check. Knight takes, king b1, then knight b3 from black. And there is literally nothing you can do to stop queen to a1 checkmate on the next move. So with that in mind, in this position, Hans Niemann had enough. After the knight sack, he resigned on the spot to Daniel Naroditsky. Wow, what a series of games by Hans Niemann in the Italian game with the move bishop to c4. He is one of the biggest Italian game experts in the world. And although he did not win all of these games, he definitely showcased his deep understanding of these positions, and I hope you enjoyed these games as much as I did. Now, if you enjoyed this video, check out my other long video on Magnus Carlsen's epic Ruy Lopez, or you can check out my Hans Niemann playlist, and I will see you in the next video.